Hello, hello to everyone who will be joining us watching this video. Hello to Florian Marcus from Estonia, who'll be joining our discussion today, along with my colleague Margarita Mendes from Fundación Coicos, and myself, Sophie Campbell-White. Florian is a digital transformation advisor at the Estonia Briefing Center, where he works for informing high-level delegations from around the world on how they can make digitalization work. We're really pleased and excited to have you with us today, and excited to learn more about your experiences with Estonia and how innovation in digitalization in particular can help make governments more open. So thank you for joining us, Florian. How are you?
Thank you very much for having me. I'm doing very well. Thank you. How are you?
Yes, I'm really well. Thank you. So to start with, we were just hoping if you could briefly describe what e-governance is and how digitalization has affected the way that Estonia is governed.
Well, e-government is effectively the digital continuation of physical government, but the digital meaning ideally that it would be a lot faster, a lot cheaper, a lot more transparent, accountable, and also easier for the end user, which is usually the citizen. And that's precisely what we've seen change in Estonia as well. So that the service quality has increased drastically. Just to give you a very simple example, you can declare your taxes online in 3 minutes. So in many countries that would take quite a bit more, maybe a bit more paper stacks as well. But it goes also into the area of civic participation. We've got online voting since 2005, meaning that it takes 30 seconds to cast your vote, and it also means that people who don't live inside your country's borders right now, that they don't have to go to the closest embassy or something, but that they can just vote from their laptop from the beach or wherever they are, and of course also things like petitions and so on. So yeah, e-government means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but I guess that's what we're here to talk about as well.
Yes,
Thank you, Florian. So, okay, the second question is, we have heard a lot about how Estonia has been since the 90s and 2000s interested in educating people about technology, the use of computers, but I think it has happened in other countries as well. I will include Colombia. But I would like to know if you consider there were some particular circumstances that facilitate that the government decides to go for e-government, like to progress more in e-government. So I would like to know what's your opinion about it.
Sure. So I think for the Estonian government back then, you have to cast your mind back to the 1990s when Estonia regained independence, actually on my birthday, from the Soviet Union. And the challenge was, first of all, we're independent again. Second, we don't have a lot of money left in the bank thanks to the Soviet Union, and also in terms of population density, we're an incredibly empty country. So rather small population, comparably big country. In terms of population density, Estonia rivals Brazil, actually. So as you can imagine, some big cities, but also lots of empty forests in between. And that was the challenge that e-government, digital services and so on, that those sought to rectify. Very, very simply for the government to be sure that the same service quality can be provided to every single citizen around the country, and ideally, speed some procedures up and also make things cheaper for the central government. So that was a sort of I'm tired of saying win-win situation, but it was a win-win situation. So yeah, that's a fair usage in this context.
Yeah, that's so interesting that the demographics of the country impacted it was a practical move to online services, and that it has benefited every party, as it were.
Yeah, this is actually one of those misunderstandings that we get from people around the world, also prime ministers and so on, that say, it only worked in Estonia because you're such a small country. 1.3 million people. we can't even learn anything from that. But actually, as I said, in that particular context, we're a very big country, population density-wise. And we've seen that population size in general does not seem to boost or hold back digital development around the world. We see countries like India and China digitalize very strongly, regardless of how we feel about the particular systems of government. And at the same time, we see many small countries struggle. So there must be something beyond sheer population size that determines the success of e-government.
And that's very interesting then. So if you would argue that population size isn't the biggest influencing factor, what do you think is?
So I have to put on my political scientist hat here.
Please do.
I would say there are two factors that I've been able to sort of see patterns in. Factor number one would be, are we talking about a federalized country or a centralized one? So we see that federal countries usually struggle more because the central government does not have that many decision powers. It might be able to give guidelines, but then the respective districts or regions decide, oh, we're actually going to go in the other direction. Whereas central governments such as Estonia usually have an easier time of implementing nationwide change. And the second aspect that seems to play quite a role, although it's not sort of exclusive, would be the question of wealth. We see that overall, poor countries are better at digitalizing than rich ones, quite frankly, because they see the necessity much more strongly. If we're talking about, very rich countries such as Switzerland, Germany, the US, they can very directly afford bad bureaucracy. They can afford to be ineffective, inefficient in that way because they've got plenty of money left in the bank. Whereas countries like Estonia in the 1990s, but also many developing countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America, they have a very different perspective on money and thus a greater incentive to digitalize.
Yeah, we in Colombia started to digitalize strongly during the pandemic. And something very interesting that happened was that we in Fundación Coicos, we teach some workshops in people who are located in small towns or villages. And for those people, the digital government means access to services, actually. Because, for example, if they will place a complaint about a hospital and the authority that investigate the hospitals, it's located or in Bogota or in big cities, so they have to travel to those places and they prefer no complaint, for example.
Yeah, no.
And now they just complain with an email from wherever they live, and this is real access to services, to public services. So yeah, it's very interesting.
I like the definition of e-government as the right to complain online. That's something that we should enforce around the world as well. Absolutely.
That's a nice slogan.
Yeah.
So moving on, we wanted to ask you about some of the key innovations that Estonia has implemented and sort of how that's affected, like you said, sort of citizens' participation in government and anti-corruption. And what do you think the key innovations for Estonia have been in those areas?
So I do have to talk just 30 seconds about the foundations outside of those areas. Number one, very simple, we have compulsory electronic identity, meaning that all of the different services, portals, and so on, I can log in with the same electronic ID. It could be your ID card, which I know in the UK is a completely separate issue. It could also be through an app called Smart ID and so on. So once you log in, then the portal knows who's talking to them right now. And also the second point would be the data exchange between different government authorities. In Estonia, it's called the X-Road. It basically helps different authorities talk to each other in an encrypted and efficient manner. But talking about the focus area at hand, so I would say number one, we've got this petition portal, which has a very difficult Estonian name. It's called Rahva Algatus. It's sort of the people's initiatives. And that's where you can, again, log in with your electronic ID and then submit a petition or something if there's something that you require, which is better than most of those petition websites that we see around the world, because for those websites, you know how easy it is to create an email account. You can just create 10 new emails, sign the petition 10 times with those email accounts, and nobody will know, what the actual legitimate number of signatures is. The second thing would be online voting, which for me personally is the most exciting online service that we have. And also when we talk about the sort of corruption and transparency area, in Estonia we have something called the data tracker, and in the data tracker is inside the state portal. I can see almost every single time when does a government authority. So which authority looks at what part of my data at what point in time, and most importantly, why? So I get the sort of context of how the government is using my address, my health records, and so on, which is a system that, sadly, to my knowledge, only exists like that in Estonia. And I wish there were more countries that would go in the same direction.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. The idea of e-voting is simple, but I'm sure it's more complicated to implement. But it's so difficult to vote. And I'm American, and to vote as an overseas citizen is one of the most complicated processes. The forms are unbelievable. It's so difficult. The idea that you could plug in your electronic ID and vote online must be, so much more accessible for every citizen, and is an incredible innovation. Do you think that there are any issues with any of these areas? Are there ways they could work better?
There are different answers to this question. So when I talk about the online voting, it could always be a prettier program or something like that, but we've actually tried to keep the design, the layout the same over the last 15 years, very simply because we have many different generations using the program, and I don't know if I suspect that you've had the same situation with your parents, just like me, where, I don't know, WhatsApp updates itself and all of a sudden there's a button on the other side of the screen and your parents don't know what's happening anymore. So we try to keep the structure reasonably similar so that people don't get confused. In terms of the system itself, it's actually proven to be very robust, very easy to use, very secure. You can always explain it better to the population. This is actually something that we found out, that how do you explain encryption to the people? How do you explain blockchain to the people? And there are so many different layers where even with the best of intentions and lots of transparency in mind, you don't want to overwhelm people at the same time. So finding the right balance there is difficult. As for the petition homepage that I mentioned, I think the system itself is really well designed. You can also check it out later online. The thing there is that Estonians are a very different type of citizen, I would say, from a sociological point of view. So I'm assuming that you've never been to Estonia. You should totally visit once the whole COVID thing is over. You will see that people don't protest on the street. If there is something really fundamentally wrong with government, maybe there's 50 people standing quietly with a sign somewhere on a square. But that's it, It's just we don't have this sort of protest culture, whereas in countries like France, people go on the street the second, a croissant is 10 cents more expensive. So there are different sections of that same scale, and Estonia falls on that one end of the spectrum, I would say. But the platform does see usage. It's just that it's not very, it's not that 20% of the people log in every week or anything like that.
Okay, that's really interesting. I understand what you mean, that some cultures do take their sort of right to protest very seriously, and if they can strike, they'll strike. But interesting that you don't see that sort of pattern in Estonia.
Yeah, being German myself, for me, I'm sort of, I guess, halfway in the middle between the French and the Estonians. So like we have obviously protests, but we don't go crazy with them. But when Margarita mentioned that sort of the right to complain online was one of the fundamental aspects of e-government for Colombians, yeah, it wouldn't be the same in Estonia.
Okay, interesting.
But do you think it's because in Estonia people feel that they are listened by the government? Like they feel strongly connected and they feel that they are properly represented? Or do you think it's because they consider protest is not a way to approach, like when you are not happy with your government?
I think it's primarily the latter. It's primarily you don't really change much with protest unless the whole country erupts if something terrible happens. But I think that overall Estonians feel quite listened to by the government. They feel quite, that the government is quite accessible. There's the saying in Estonia that the prime minister is always only 2 calls away. So that's good, but political divisions and disagreements exist in Estonian society just like anywhere else. So there will be a sizable part of the society that whatever the government or the party in government is, they will not feel represented or disagree with the policies. So yeah, I think it's primarily the sort of sociological background.
Thank you. Now, we believe, because it's an assumption, we have heard from many different sources that Estonia is incredibly efficient as government, but we would like to confirm with you if this is possible in all different areas. So technology in the private sector and all the technological improvements that we see these days make services cheaper and more effective in making customers happy. However, with the public sector, that around the world, people think that more public spending is more welfare for people. But we would like to know if this is different in Estonia, like. People have the understanding that government have to be also very efficient, making the best use of costs, and also if all the public services benefit from digitalization and digitalization make them less expensive and more effective achieving their goals.
Yeah. So I think as most Estonians would be, very surprised to hear a statement like more government spending is more good for people. That sounds scary. Estonians are quite proud of, until COVID-19, having had a very balanced budget, actually, without any extra expenditures. So, of course, there are areas where investments make a lot of sense. Education is one of them. Digital infrastructure, 5G, broadband, fiberglass connections, absolutely. But the rest, when we're talking about the bureaucratic procedures, less is more. Yeah. If I can automate, let's imagine the entire tax office, that all tax queries are handled by AI. That would not be a bad thing. That actually means that those people who used to work in the government, they can work in the private sector and create additional value, create new jobs, create new intellectual property, and so on. So in that way, Estonia has been painfully aware since the 1990s that every single person who works in the public sector is wasted investment, quite frankly. So the more digital we are, the better it is. But at the same time, we have to say that it's not like the Estonian public sector is a lot smaller than in other countries. So the OECD average used to be, I think, around 20.7% of the working population in OECD countries works in the public sector. And in Estonia, it's 21%. So it's just that the people who work in the public sector, they don't just fill out documents and send them to the next person and so on, but rather they are cybersecurity specialists. They are service and homepage designers. They are, legal experts for data exchange. And all of this stuff that most other governments don't even have a position for. So that's the main difference that I would see. But we've certainly seen that Estonian government is extremely efficient. For example, I mentioned the tax declaration in Estonia. When actually 2 months ago, I bought some real estate, and I did that completely online in 20 minutes. So I had seen the land itself. But I had never met with the seller. I had never met with the notary. We just met online through a sort of video platform. And I gave a digital signature to confirm my purchase. I sent the money through online banking, and that was it. And then the next day I got a notification saying, congratulations, you're the new owner. So this sort of digitalization doesn't just mean a lot more convenience, but it also means that for COVID-19, Estonian society was a lot more resilient because we already knew how to give digital signatures. We already knew how to vote online and so on. So it didn't have, of course, it touched us, the tourism sector and so on, but it didn't have as strong an effect as it did in many other countries.
That's really interesting. I hadn't even considered that, how digitalization made your sort of the public sector a lot more robust during the pandemic.
Yeah, for sure. And also, if we look at the intersection of private and public, or rather, so the people's side, e-education. In Estonia, we've had an e-school system for every single school in the country since the early 2000s. So, grades, homework, test results, and so on, they would all be handed out digitally for many years now. And so when I think it was a Thursday or Friday last year in spring, when the government said, all right, from next Monday onwards, all the schools are going to be closed. And the schools were like, okay, we've got the tools to do that. Yeah. So, a very different level of resilience. Absolutely.
I would like to add something, because everything you say sounds so good. That of course you feel jealous. Like, I think everyone would like to have like an Estonia, Estonia in their own countries. But I'm wondering if there has been some kind of resistance from anyone from the government to say, I don't want this to be digitalized, or from the Estonian people that they say, okay, I like digitalization, but in these aspects, I prefer to continue like in the traditional way, or everything has been like very organic.
No, everything's been perfect. No, of course there has been resistance. Usually not so much from the population, because the population understands that privacy on paper is an illusion. If I ask you, just a very simple example. So some people hear that in Estonia all e-health records are digitalized and technically accessible to any doctor in the country, but you can block access to people, like for certain doctor's visits. And of course, if there's a doctor who looked at your medical files and it wasn't, you didn't give consent, then you've got the data tracker where you can see that, and the doctor might lose their license. But it sounds scary when you first hear it, perhaps for some people. And then they say, paper is much better for that. But it's not really, because if I ask you who has looked at your medical records over the last 5 years, chances are that you can't even tell me, because it's on paper. And if, I don't know, maybe you have a neighbor who's a doctor in the same hospital, he just sees that you come home with a broken leg or something, he will go into the files and see what happened to you, and you won't even find out. Yeah. So the sort of the privacy on paper is very rarely a thing. So the people were usually quite happy and on board with the developments. I would say that some of the professionals were more hesitant. So let's stay actually with the e-health example. Some of the doctors said, "Oh, this is going to cost us money to digitalize our systems. It will take time away from patients, like the doctor-patient time." And we have to train and school our staff and so on. It's going to be a mess. Obviously, in the mid to long term, the opposite was true. yes, of course, you had to invest a bit at the start, but people now have more time for their patients. We see that the treatment quality in the more rural regions in those hospitals has increased drastically because we now have telemedicine with connections to the best doctors in the country, where they can share medical data and so on effectively, in real time. So yeah, there are sometimes people who resist the change, but the government also has to be quite clear in its priorities. Who do we create digitalization for? It is never for the doctors. It is never for the tax advisors. It is always for the end user, the citizen, who is supposed to benefit from that.
I would like to ask you something. It wasn't prepared before, but
oh no,
it makes me wonder now that you mentioned this, because now that during the pandemic, I realized that internet became the main source to access to everything. So to the doctors, because here doctors didn't receive you unless it was absolutely necessary. So you always had to go through a online how do you call it?
Consultation.
Thank you so much. And but for Colombian government, the highest access for things are telephones, computers. Internet is expensive, and I start to think, okay, this should be, at least for the pandemic, a fundamental human right. Like, we should lower taxes, but the government didn't. I mean, computers became more expensive because the price of peso fall. Because we depend a lot on petrol. Petrol was not being sold, so a lot of people had more difficulties to access to. Was like a mess, and even the government didn't. So let's reduce at least the taxes over these things so people can access. And internet is considered a luxury, so you have to pay extra. I wonder if from the starting you have considered that access to internet is fundamental. Like, I don't know, for example, in Colombia, if we don't have electricity, the people who fix the infrastructure for electricity, they work 24 hours. So because we consider fundamental to have electricity. But it's funny that it's not fundamental to have internet. So they don't work 24 hours, and sometimes you need for contact the doctor. So I'm wondering how this works in Estonia. This is like considered important. You have considered the access for people?
Yeah. So as internet is considered as a social right in Estonia. That means it's not codified as a human right or anything, but it's quite close, I would say. This has led to all kinds of developments. I'll give you a very simple one. In most countries, the different network providers, like the different phone companies, they would all build up their own infrastructure across the country, right? So maybe with one provider, you've got 80% reception in the country, but it's a bit more expensive. With one, you've got only in the biggest cities, but it's half the price, and so on. In Estonia, all the different network providers share the same network infrastructure, meaning regardless of which service provider you use, you will have around 98% 4G coverage in the country. Now, the question is, how much does that cost? Well, because they effectively they pooled the costs for the infrastructure, it's also quite cheap. In Estonia, so I can just talk about myself, I've got 10 gigabytes of data per month, free phone calls and text messages, whatever. No one uses that stuff anymore. And I pay €8 per month. So 10 US dollars roughly, which is, I think, a quite fair deal. So I mean, internet access, especially when government talks about digital nomads and new ways of working, and the fourth industrial revolution and so on. If we're talking about all of that stuff, then we also have to talk connectivity. I'm not going to go and criticize the Colombian government for a specific policy or something, but if you want to build a country on digital services, then internet connection is exactly as important as electricity. that's the truth of it.
Thank you. I think we can move on to the next question, Sophie.
Oh yes, we were. Well, I mean, we've spoken about it briefly earlier about the way in which individuals and businesses pay tax in Estonia, and we see sort of around the world that governments are a lot more interested in people paying taxes and less about people being informed of how taxes are spent. That information is much harder to find in comparison. So in the case of Estonia, to what extent are they better informed about how taxes are spent?
I think there's also still, I don't even know if you can say there's work to do. That depends on your ethical outlook on life. But you've got the budget information and so on quite transparent. You've got participatory budgeting in many cities. So that let's say the city government of Tallinn says, hey, we've got 400,000 euros. What do we spend it on? You know, do we build a bridge? Do we make the playgrounds nicer for the kids? You know that sort of stuff. In Tallinn, we've got an app for that where you can sort of go through the city map of Tallinn and click on the different projects and vote on them. But there's different solutions for that. I think that in general, the government is still trying to make all of these services and the duties of the citizens easier as well. Even if we're not talking about paying taxes, but things that you might be entitled to. In Estonia, you get child benefit payments when you get a child, as you do in many countries around the world. But usually people would have to apply for it, and then they are either accepted or rejected. There's some paperwork to do, blah, blah, blah. In Estonia, what we've done is in the state portal, you just get a notification that says, congratulations on the birth of your child, to which bank account do we send the money? So you no longer have to apply. You no longer even have to be aware that you are entitled to a service. And this is a point about inclusion that is often overlooked in e-government. Of course, if you just transfer an offline, like a paper service, to the online world, people still have to apply actively for everything, then it doesn't work like that. But if the government informs you, hey, because of your religious, social, economic, blah, blah, blah background, you are entitled to service X. Do you want it? Yeah. This way you can make sure that all of these social safety nets that different governments around the world built up, that they're actually being used as well. We can see many countries around the world where the government has earmarked part of the budget for a certain service, but it's not being used. Usually because people are not aware that it exists or that they fall into that category. So this can help as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And do you see that there's a good turnout in terms of the public looking at this information and engaging with these platforms you were describing?
I would not be the right person to answer like how the different apps are being used, but I can get you in touch with the people that made it. So no worries there. From what I've seen, I think this goes back to the sort of societal question of how people feel about participation. How proactive they want to go about stuff like that. So I think it could still be higher, absolutely. But I think this is also something that will just develop as democracies grow. And to be quite clear, Estonian democracy is still comparably young. So around about 30 years now, and 20 years back from the 1918 to 1939. So there's still some time for participatory democracy to flourish in Estonia as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting consideration, isn't it? That how it being a relatively young democracy and sort of the political regime development having impacted
absolutely.
People get involved in the public sector.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you, in your personal experience, like with your close community, friends, colleagues, do you feel that people feel, like you say, the government feels accessible, but also people feel they have this duty to get involved, that they often try to get in more ways than just voting, because in Colombia there is like a strong feeling that people have to vote, that's like even a moral obligation. But in other aspects, people tend not to participate sometimes because it feels like not that accessible. But I would like to ask you, because many times is what people say, no? If the government is accessible, I will for sure participate. But I want to ask you, because if you live in the country where there is things seems to be very accessible, people tend to change their culture. They tend to be more involved in public issues, or they try to relax because they say, the government will do things for me.
Not that important. Yeah.
They will see for me.
Yeah. I don't think you can generalize that for all countries, but I'll give you a very simple example. In the European Union, just a couple of years ago, the General Data Protection Regulation was implemented, the GDPR, which basically meant that whenever you would visit a website, they would ask you, hey, what cookies can we use? And then you've got the chance to either sort of reject some or click accept all or whatever. So technically now people are given a relatively simple choice that takes maybe 10 seconds to make sure like what they're okay with and what they're not. Now, I will ask Sophie very quickly, because you used to live in the EU until Brexit happened. Do you always click the different cookies that you're okay with and that you're not, or do you say accept all?
I'm honestly so glad you asked me this, because I can hand on heart tell you I have no idea what a cookie is, and I've never looked at them.
Okay, see that's precisely the problem. So cookie, to everybody who's watching, is very simply the sort of tracer that different companies use to see how you're using the website, what sort of ads are best suited to give to you on that website, and so on. So. And most people are exactly like you, Sophie, and they say, yeah, whatever, just I want to see the news that I just want to see the link that I clicked on. So what we did was, what the EU did was, they gave people a relatively easy choice of complete control over their privacy on third-party websites. Most people don't give a shit, quite frankly. So this is, and I think this is also what we would see with participation in many countries around the world, that people are now complaining, oh, if it was more accessible, then I would totally attend every single town hall meeting and every single decision and so on. But when it comes to the decision, do I feed my baby at home or do I go to the town hall meeting? Do I work an extra hour so that I don't have to deal with emails tomorrow morning, or do I go to the town hall meeting? Most of the people will switch back to their daily lives. And this is, I'm not saying this in a critical tone, this is just how life works for most people.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so now I would like to move a little bit to an international aspect of your work. I know that you give like advice to people around the world about how to digitalize governments. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, in your experience, what aspects of the government tend other countries to be more appeal to digitalize, and what things do you think governments are more concerned or have more reserves about digitalizing?
Yeah,
I'll give you an example. Don't know, countries are happy to have e-voting, but they don't like this e-council that you have in sign with your digital signature or don't know. I would like you. Yeah.
Yeah, so people are very open to the electronic identity. So just that, because government wants to know who you are online. People are quite open to the digital signature. They're quite open to the online tax system as well, because it makes it easier for government to collect its revenue. People are quite open to the e-healthcare system as well, because I think this is one of those factors that most politicians have accepted around the world. The population is getting older and older, and we have fewer and fewer people to take care of those elderly. So, like, somewhere we need to find efficiencies soon, and e-health is one of those areas. online voting, more people are skeptical because for many people it's hard to imagine how it could be safe or how it could be a secret vote at the same time. I think generally people are quite open about a lot of those things. Yeah. No, overall, the people that do come to us are quite happy to change their own countries.
Yeah, I would like to know, do you think that with technology you have currently is definitely safe to go for e-voting, like absolutely safe, or if you translate these to other countries? Because I assume that you're happy with how e-voting is working in Estonia. But for example, if I tell you, okay, I would like this to be taken to Colombia, you think because why is considered that digitalization brings transparency is because the human factor is not there. Yeah.
You can't bribe
many
the computer.
times.
Yeah,
in theory. But if it's translated to Colombia, do you think there are risks? Like, we have lots of issues with voting because there are like lots of frauds. So, for example, buying votes is very common and etc. But do you think if we transfer this to Colombia, that technology like the blockchain is easy to be transferred, or you need this human factor still to be in position to provide security, or is easy to transfer to Colombia, for example?
So two things, just very quickly. Number one, we don't use blockchain for voting, but that's just encryption. No, all good. Just we've had some journalists a few years ago saying, "No, it's blockchain voting." Not quite. Encryption is perfectly fine for that. But the second point, you should never expect to be able to copy paste one solution from one to another country 100%. Doesn't work, and that's okay. That's actually good. I think, though, that if you would implement both the technology and the legal framework and the rules that we've set up in Estonia as well, that in those instances, it should be a success in Colombia as well. You know, we've got, we're all humans. We all live in countries. So like the physical framework is the same for all of us. One very simple solution that we've had for the possibility of people buying or trying to buy other people's votes. In Estonia, we've got, so every election is 10 days long, and the first 7 days are digital only. And during those 7 days, you can vote online through your laptop and so on. But the clue here is that you can vote as many times as you want, and only the last vote counts. So if you want to buy my vote for 50 euros and Sophie as well, I can take your 50 euros. I will show you that I vote for your candidate on my laptop. Then I will go to Sophie. She will pay me 50 euros for her candidate. I will show her that I vote for her candidate. Then I go home. I vote a third time for my actual candidate, my actual preferred choice. And that, again, the last vote counts. So, you know, there are ways of going around some of these challenges. You just have to be pragmatic and creative.
Great, thank you so much.
Just as a final question, and it's quite a big one, and I'll apologize now. Is there any advice you have for the individual citizen to encourage their governments to be more transparent?
I think that transparency is a very open-ended word, and that countries can, start an initiative and say, look, we're more transparent now, but not much has changed. I would say that, obviously, within the context of where I work, petitioning or voting for the party that has the best e-government plan is a good idea to bring digitalization more on the sort of political debate spectrum, and then hopefully drive that discussion towards more transparency as well. So we see, I mean, I get visitors from all around the world every single day, and they say like, oh, why isn't e-government a big thing in Germany or Spain or wherever? And then I say, well, when did you last vote for the party with the best e-government plan? Let me guess, you never have. Yeah, maybe you voted for health, maybe you voted for education, maybe you voted for foreign policy, but who here has ever voted because of the best e-government plan? So this is something that we also, as citizens, have to prioritize and push on the national agenda.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful recommendation. I just found everything you said really interesting, and how how citizens of Estonia have reacted to the change in digitalization, and sort of how the setup of newer democracy and demographics has sort of worked. And I wondered if either of you had any sort of final words, summary, to wrap up our discussion.
I do, but I don't want to take it away from Margarita.
Well, I first want to thank you for very honest responses. We were very interested in having conversations that we cannot find still online, because we have found lots of information about Estonia, and sometimes it's good to also face some myths that are created about Estonia, but I think it still is great. I think a final conclusion that anyone who watches this video is that there are different ways to see things, and I completely agree with you that there is no these expectations that digitalization is important, but pandemic should show us how important it is. But not just that, but is also how accessible it makes things, like in a country like Colombia, where in rural areas we don't have these institutions that close, and it's expensive to build all the institutions, but you can bring them just with technology. And finally, I like the idea that in something is different. Like, for example, you mentioned Spain, like why Spain don't have digitalization. Spain is one of those countries where people still discussing that public spending should grow and grow and not become efficient. And sometimes it's something we definitely forget, that efficiency is not just for the private sector or capitalism. It can be in all the different aspects. And I think in the public sector is very, very important. And I think is the main lesson for me. So thank you so much.
Absolutely, yeah. Maybe one thing that I would add to the end of the conversation. Both the two of you and the viewers at home may have heard about E-Residency before. So E-Residency being this very simple idea that people around the world who have maybe never even seen Estonia firsthand, that they can apply for an electronic identity just like the one that I have, and you can create a business in Estonia. You can, give legally binding digital signatures just like I can. So it gives you a sort of taste of what's possible. And for anyone who would like to sort of, experience that, E-Residency is an easy gateway into that. We have got actually many Colombians and people from Latin America in general that have used this, and this also gives a very important message to governments around the world. It's very simple. If your country, whether it's Colombia or any other country in the world, if your country does not provide the digital services, the solutions that your young people, your talent expects, they will leave. Global work mobility has never been higher than before. I mean, except COVID maybe, and it will only grow. So what that means is it's never been easier to go to another country if you're sick and tired of your home country. And in the worst case scenario, those people will leave completely. They will hear, oh my God, everything's amazing in Estonia or Denmark or wherever, and I will just go there. That's when you lose all of the tax income from that person. Or in the sort of best case scenario, people will use something like E-Residency. So they will still pay land tax, value-added tax on items, like through purchase in your country, but they will create jobs, intellectual property, and so on abroad, right? So the faster you get on the digitalization train, the better your chance to sort of stop this brain drain that countries around the world are experiencing today. But thanks so much for having me overall. It was a lovely discussion and great questions. And yeah, I don't know. Do we have any last things that we have to mention?
No, I don't think so. But once again, thank you for joining us. Thanks for the discussion.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Have a lovely day, guys.
Yes.